Welcome to this overview of how to conduct a paired samples t-test in SPSS. So while we're going through the video, I'll also be talking about some of the key features of this paired samples t-test, specifically about data entry and what that looks like, but then also how we interpret the data as we get to the end of the test. So if you're following along in the textbook using IBM SPSS Statistics 2nd edition, they give an example there, our textbook for the class, and specifically it's very helpful to understand how the data is entered because that has everything to do with how the data is analyzed. So for this specific test, I'll be going through all of the steps to help you see how that works, and it just literally takes you step by step through the whole entire process. So the first thing it asks you to do is to open a new data file. So we go to File, New Data, and SPSS takes a minute, but it creates a new one for us. So there we go. Minimize that one. So here's my new data set. And it specifically is the data editor. When I save it, it will be that kind of a data file. The output file is a different kind of file. And I start by going to variable view and entering my variables. My first variable in this particular data set is blood pressure measured at baseline, or what they're calling pre-test. And so I'm going to call it BL underscore PRES1. And then I'm going to give it a label. I'm going to call it blood pressure pre-test so that it matches what they've given us. And then what they do is they take these military recruits. This is a scenario that they've given us, and they do some kind of an intervention. They scare them. And then after that happens, they take their blood pressure a second time. So here we have blood underscore pressure 2. So this is the blood pressure post-test. And you might wonder why we have to give the variable a name and a label. The label is very nice to have when we're creating our graphs so that it's more of a description of what that particular variable is. The name historically has been limited to 8 characters. It isn't anymore, but you are not allowed to have any spaces, certain punctuation marks, that kind of thing. And so the name can be quite limited. And so we want to have something that other people would understand. If we were to make a graph or a table, then they would read it and they would know what that means. We use shorthand often in the naming convention, but the label can be written out in longhand. So the next thing we do is we go to our data view and we enter the data. And literally I could click on each of these cells and start entering. What I've done is I've actually pre-entered this in Excel. I can just copy that and paste it there. So there are my 12 subjects. And the thing I want to point out specifically is that each one of these rows represents a specific person. And since we measured each person twice, then we would need to have 2 columns that represent those blood pressure measurements. So in other words, this person number 1, we measured their blood pressure. It was 122. Then we had that intervention, the scare, and then we measured the blood pressure again in the same person, and that is 133. So this blood pressure at baseline, the 122, goes with the 133 that was measured after. You can't match up any after blood pressure with a pre-blood pressure. They're specific to that particular person. So that's why we put them here in the rows together. So each row is a case or a person, and we measured those twice. And then I've already labeled my variables in variable view. That's this label right here. So the variable name is the shorthand version and the variable label is the longhand version. So the next thing that I'm going to do is save my data set and the instructions say name it blood pressure. So I'm going to hit this little save icon, and here it is. I'm going to call it blood pressure, and now it's saved. Notice that this save icon is divoted out, it's grayed out as soon as I don't have any changes that need to be updated. So if I had other changes that needed to be added to that, then it would show up as a blue icon again, and I could click save and it would save it again as bloodpressure.sav. So that's my .sav file. The next thing I want to do is actually analyze that data with the paired samples t-test. So I'm going to go to Analyze, Compare Means, Paired Samples. And you'll notice that this little icon over here to the left is trying to help you out, is trying to remind you that you're looking at this before and after. If it was bigger, then you could kind of zoom in on it. But so the little icon is different depending on which test we're clicking on. With the paired samples t-test, I have a pair that I'm going to enter together. Now I can enter that in two ways. I can click on that here on the left and enter them one at a time, blood pressure 1, blood pressure 2, or I can actually click on one, hold down the shift button, click on the second one, and then move them both over there together at the same time. So either one of those works. If you're entering a whole bunch of pairs, then sometimes it's nice to select them as pairs so you don't have to click the arrow quite as many times. So now that I have my pre-blood pressure and my post-blood pressure over there on the right-hand side, the next thing I do is I click OK. And in my output viewer, here's my output for today. This is what I end up seeing. So let me walk you through this output here. What we have in the first box is we have the blood pressure pre-test and the blood pressure post-test, and it has calculated the averages or the means for each of those time frames. And so the average at pre-test was 130.5, the average at post-test was 135.5. And you can see our standard deviations are fairly similar to each other as well. This is going to help us out to see what direction that change happened, if it does in fact end up being statistically significant or noticeable. This second box gives us some information about correlations, and we're going to learn more about correlations later, so we're just going to skip over those. This third box is really the one that is of interest to us. This first section that has almost all of the information talks about that paired difference. In other words, they looked at the pre and the post and they wanted to see what the difference is for each of those pairs. The average paired difference was a -5. Now what we've done is we've taken the blood pressure pre-test and subtracted out the blood pressure post-test. So you can do the math yourself. 130.5 minus 135.5 is a -5. So the difference is taking the pre minus the post. So that's hence the -5. We can see our standard deviation, standard error, and then we get a 95% confidence interval around that difference. And remember how our mean difference is a -5, and so our lower is -8.52199, and our upper is -1.47801. What you'll notice always is that when we have a point estimate and then there's a 95% confidence interval around it, that point estimate needs to be somewhere close to the middle of that confidence interval, because the confidence interval gives us a lower, like going down, and an upper or going up, like a buffer around that confidence interval. So that mean needs to be somewhere there in the middle. And then the other thing that we get for our paired samples t-test is we get a t-value, which is our critical ratio. So the critical ratio for a paired samples t-test is t, hence it's called a t-test. And here we have a value of 3.125. And then we get a p-value, or in In SPSS, that's called SIG. And by default, we do these as two-tailed tests. There is a kind of a discussion about that in your textbook if you're interested. But mainly, we're focused on the two-tailed tests because they tend to be a little more conservative and more accepted by the statistics community. Remember that our degrees of freedom is n-1, so that's how we end up with 11. We started out with 12 people in our study, and we subtract 1, so then we have degrees of freedom is equal to 11. So that is a summary of the paired samples t-test in SPSS. Thank you for joining me.